Hello, beloved. I am Pastor Victor Resendiz. Welcome to this weekly series called God is Love, conversations on compassion, justice, and spirituality. Each week, we will explore our role as Christian believers in today's national dialogue around race and racism. We'll be joined by Liz Peterson, Assistant Director of Houston Coalition Against Hate, a network of organizations, institutions, and individuals committed to preventing and addressing all forms of hate in our community. We invite you to listen for the transforming Word of God, as together we seek to fully embody the great commandment to love God and love neighbor. Hello, we're here with Liz Peterson. I'm Pastor Victor Resendiz, and we are here finally. We've been talking about this for a couple of weeks, Liz, and trying to prepare for this space that you and I have had several conversations. You've came to Memorial Drive and did a presentation for our staff and our clergy. So let me just kind of invite everyone of what this is about. I know our introduction gives a brief explanation of what the purpose of these 5 conversations that we're going to have throughout the weeks. But I also want to just invite everyone to lean in towards, the topics that we'll be covering, some of the reflections that we will, just be sharing. So mainly the desire of this space is based on the call as the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church has a very clear message that we are to be instrumental in God's mission towards anything that has to do with social justice. But before I do that, I do want to say, at least give you a chance to say hello back. How are you?
Good.
I'll build you up in a little bit. So let me just kind of share a little bit from this book. I just happened to take polity class and finish just literally today. I just finished all my exams and everything for the semester. So in the polity class, we got to read this book, polity and the doctrine class. We got to read this book, United Methodist Doctrine, and it's written by our Bishop Jones. But this is what the Methodists say about social justice. Our struggles for human dignity and social reform have been a response to God's demand for love, mercy, and justice in the light of the kingdom. We proclaim no personal gospel that fails to express itself in relevant social concerns. We proclaim no social gospel that does not include the personal transformation of sinners. It is our conviction that the good news of the kingdom must judge, redeem, and reform the sinful social structures of our time. The Book of Discipline and the general rules convey the expectation of discipline within the experience of individuals in the life of the church. Such discipline assumes accountability to the community of faith by those who claim that community support. So it's pretty clear that as Methodists, this is our call. This is a priority of ours. That part of our core beliefs and our doctrine is to be advocates to social justice issues because that's God's heart. And so we definitely have a desire to be aligned to God's heart. So without further ado, so Liz, in the introduction, we gave your title and that you work for an association by the name of Houston Coalition Against Hate. Tell us a little bit about what you do there and just the type of work that you're involved with and the type of collaboration that you have with others.
Sure. So, yes, thank you. I'm so happy to be here and to be trying this experiment with you. So the Houston Coalition Against Hate is an organization made up of 65 plus diverse institutions, organizations, and individuals here in Houston who are joining together to fight back against hate and to increase belonging in our community. So we do that largely through the arts. We have a big focus on using arts to spark conversation between communities, and we do a lot of training, and that's kind of my passion. We are working on building up a training program for our members to learn more about diversity and inclusion, justice and equity, and also how can we take that out into the community. So I'm really glad to have this conversation with you.
Sure. Thank you so much for giving us a little bit of an elaborate explanation of what you do and who you collaborate with. I guess my first question, Liz, and you and I have had this kind of offline as well. You know, it's a tense time in the headlines, and I don't want to name one particular case that has been in the headlines because they're all very important. So one of the top questions that I get as a pastor from people that I have conversations with, whether they are part of our congregation or just in general, it's their concern of the main question is, what do I do? How do I, I want to learn more about it, especially if maybe something's being prompted in their heart, a desire to make a change. And so I'm pretty sure in your line of work, that's something that, you have people come to you to ask you the same question. What's your what's the first step that you encourage them, or that you just kind of, invite them to consider?
I mean, I would, this sounds cheesy in a church conversation, but I would say pray, really to pray for an open mind, pray for the courage to find out that you've been wrong in the past, pray for the courage to mess up and learn and have people tell you that you've messed up and learn from those mistakes and vow to do better. Pray for the courage to have really uncomfortable conversations that we've spent our whole lives avoiding. Pray for the wisdom to know where to find information that is out there, that is available for us. It's the number one thing that I would tell people outside of a Christian context, is to educate yourself. Whatever means that you use to educate yourself about anything you're passionate about, find that resource in anti-racism. There are so many books, there are so many podcasts, movies, social media outlets, essays, articles for you to find. There's no one read this and then you'll understand everything and everything will be better resource. That just doesn't exist. It's a lifelong process of exploring realities that were really kept from us as, speaking for myself, as somebody from a higher socioeconomic status, obviously a white person with a master's degree. This isn't the stuff that we were taught in school and college, even in my graduate program. And it's just a process of committing to taking a step forward every day and learning and unlearning.
Yeah, I appreciate that sincerity. And I'm glad that you're mentioning the spiritual part first, because as a pastor, I think they go both hand in hand. Our instinct is that, especially in a situation, and this is something in the environment, that people want to run directly to resources and learn everything they can. But you're right. I think leaning in towards presenting this in God's presence first makes a lot of sense, because this is not separate from our testimony nor our commission as Christians. This has to be part of what we embody. Some of the pushback that I hear sometimes is, well, the church is not supposed to be political. Well, this has nothing to do about being political. This has to do about advocating for something that's just. And even some of us that may just have a Sunday school education know that the Sermon of the Mount is very clear about that. Jesus talks about these Beatitudes, and part of it is bringing justice and being a peacemaker. And you're right. It does start there with sort of a spiritual opening to saying God, leaning in towards God and saying, teach me, show me. I want to read this book, and I want to hear maybe something that I'm resisting, but I want you to help me ease into it or lose grip or even confess it if I need to. I want to watch this documentary. It's going to make me feel uncomfortable. It's going to say things that may hurt, maybe things that I already knew, but I didn't want to face. So give me the ease, the easiness to accept it in your presence, that I can trust you, that you're going to, that you're going to transform that part of my heart. I call it part of our brokenness, to be honest with you. This is not necessarily a full judge of character of folks that may, as you just said, were not taught growing up. But also that this is just part of our brokenness, and that God is the healer of it, and God will restore that part of us. God will mature us in that part. So thank you for starting with that, because that is true. And so to kind of bridge in our spiritual piece, I want to connect, which I find very important, because you did this with us in the staff, the education piece, Liz. You've seen our resource website, and you've seen what we put in our church website. What's your opinion about, or not necessarily what's your opinion, but what's your take on those resources? And then guide us to the first step, how to look at those resources and how to, educate ourselves in a healthy manner. What's your take on that?
Gosh, I mean, that is a very loaded question, in the sense that I know that there are resources on that page that rub people like the coarsest sandpaper. And I completely understand that. They aren't all the resources that I personally point people towards. But it's like we're all grasping for the ability to solve this problem right now. And a couple of books have been put forward as solving this, as the key to solving this problem. And the fact of the matter is, there is no key. Like, I guess I'm repeating myself, but there is, if Robin DiAngelo's book turns you off, you will not be alone. It is not my favorite book. It is not one that I recommend to people, particularly starting out. It's very, very hardcore. If it doesn't fit for you, please just move on to another one of the list. Or even if you just Google, like, how do I learn about racism? There have been so many resources put forward. You could spend the rest of your life reading resources. I don't encourage you to do that, because we can get caught up, like you said, in learning, and not actually put ourselves out there in the community, or work on making the changes that need to be made to dismantle some of the problematic systems that exist out there. But just don't, I just want to say, like, don't open one book and be like, well, I disagree with this, and then I'm done with all anti-racism work.
Sure.
You have to hear a lot of different voices, and a lot of them will sound like sandpaper, particularly as you're starting out. So one of the resources that I point a lot of people to is a book that's not on the list, that's called Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria? It is a really great book in that it explains how people of all races go through the development of their racial understanding. So Black people, Hispanic people, white people, we all have these experiences of how we interact with race, and they're different. And it helps give you a peek into how somebody from a different race is experiencing their racial identity, and how that kind of influences how we interact with each other. I know a lot of people have a sense, well, if they would just stop yelling at me, maybe I would listen to them. And I think in that book, it kind of helps you to understand, where does that anger come from, and why is that being manifest, and how can I step aside and not take that personally, and realize it's not all about me, Liz Peterson, that there's these large forces in our world that are that are at work and that are largely out of our individual control, but that collectively we can come together and make changes.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, I appreciate you saying that, because that's such a it's such a, a a good way to really open myself up, as you said, because this some of the material will be difficult. But you know, I'm thinking too, as you're telling me, and I know I've heard this before, but I want everyone else to listen to it. You didn't get to this point just overnight. You've had your own journey. So I want you to talk a little bit about your personal journey, where now this became actually your call. You know, God called you to do this and become a bridge of this type of material. Um, Tell me a little bit about that. Just how did you get started? When was
Yeah,
your realization?
absolutely. Well, it really all ties back to Memorial Drive, believe it or not. Um, I have been attending Memorial Drive for about 10 years. And about 6 years ago, I had recently become a mother. And I had also recently really begun to deepen my faith beyond just, okay, like I'm going to come to worship and I'm going to check the box and then I'm going to go home. I was starting to realize that what I was saying at church meant something, and I wasn't living out those proclamations Monday to Saturday. And it was really my daughter that having this infant that convicted me of that. Like, what kind of world am I setting up for her, and what kind of example am I setting for her in what it means to be a human and what it means to be a Christian? And it came kind of to a head in the summer of 2016. Two things were happening at the same time. One, Pastor Michael and Pastor Ginny invited me and you and a number of other people
Mhm, mhm.
to create what we were calling a social justice council. And that was the first time that I had been introduced to the idea of justice versus charity. I think there's another word for it, but it's not coming to mind right now. We'll just use
Mhm.
justice and charity. So the idea is, if you're a charitable person or a charitable organization, and you're seeing a bunch of people drowning in a river, and every day you go and you scoop people out of the river and save them from drowning, that's an admirable and Christian thing to do, right? But there's another step that we can take toward justice, which is going up the river and figuring out what is it that's pushing these people into this stream, you know?
Sure.
And that struck me, and I really took that to heart. So at the same time was when Alton Sterling was killed by police in Louisiana. And I happened to be, hanging out and watching TV or watching YouTube videos when I probably should have been going to sleep. And I saw a video on social media of a press conference that was being held with Alton Sterling's widow, and his teenage son was standing at her side trying to be supportive to her. But he was so devastated by the loss of his father that he was bawling into his polo shirt, just covering his face with it, and just like completely devastated. And for some Godsmack lightning moment, I just realized, like, there is no reason that he's him and I'm me, that I have all this privilege of a beautiful big house, and I have the privilege of not working. At that time I had a membership at the Houstonian, so I
Sure.
can go and sit by the pool and listen to music and think, this is so terrible what's happening to these people, and not really do anything about it. And in that moment, I just realized I couldn't continue to click like or dislike on a post and go about my day.
Wow. Oh, that's powerful. Um, so once that became, your call, your immediate call, once you started to get educated with it, tell me one thing you struggled with, and then tell me one thing that you saw change in yourself to take you to the next level of. And I think the word of you were talking about the word charity. When I think about it, is a word of compassion. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that there's this awakening of our already designed compassion that we all have, and I think that's what you're referring to. So tell me one thing that you you know that was pretty uneasy for you to face, but then that same thing is the one that got you to the next level of compassion. What was that like?
Um, so thank you for that question because I had the same experience that a lot of people are having, that feeling of like not knowing where to turn, how to learn, how to talk to people. So I think that I am a recovering perfectionist and I am very afraid of making a public mistake and of sounding like an idiot or of hurting someone in, unintentionally. And that has been the big, like, I continue to work on that to this day. So the biggest challenge for me has been stepping into spaces where I know I'm going to be the only white person, or I'm going to be one of the only white people, and I'm not going to know um, what is expected, like what do people say there, what do people do there, what do they wear, how do they act, um, or speaking out, intervening if I hear something. How do I say to someone, hey, like, and I continue to work on it. I continue to stumble over my words. I've lost relationships with
Mm-hmm.
people who have said, I didn't do it right, or I did something that hurt them, to a Black woman, and I have not understood it, and I've had to deeply dig out what is going on within me. But all
Sure,
of those experiences have built my stamina for being able to be comfortable in space, in more and more spaces, and to speak up when I see something that's not quite right,
sure,
uh, and to tell my truth and to educate people.
sure. And one thing that I do want to encourage those that are listening to this conversation is you and I both can agree that this is ongoing work. It's lifetime work. Isn't that right? Because even as a pastor and as a person of color, um, and I'm not going to get too much into my story, but I did have to, at one point, as I was learning more about social justice education, I had to look at my own biases, which was surprising for me because I was always under the impression of being the suppressed individual or the suppressed kind, so to speak, whatever you want to label it as. Unfortunately, that these labels exist. But the point is that I had to search deeply when some of the social justice education started to confront me, where I was surprisingly, I had to look at myself and go, well, how many times have I said things that were inappropriate, or was it, did not include a particular group of people, maybe in school or maybe during, my adult life. So yeah, it is ongoing work and it is lifetime work, and you're going to slip, but like you slip, you get those slips. What I found are the sort of the wake up calls that stuff still exists in us. I know you brought some education piece. Speaking of a little bit of education for us, so I want to give you that opportunity right now for you to share that with us. Um, I know that you brought a bit of the presentation that you showed the staff a month ago. So if you want to prep that.
Sure, yeah. And just to give folks context for what I'm going to prepare or what I'm going to present, what I told Victor that I wanted to really lay the groundwork in this session is language and understanding what we're talking about when we're talking about racism. Because a lot of people, particularly us white people, when we hear that we're talking about racism, we think that we're talking about individual meanness,
Mm,
or kind of like the KKK, or using the N word, having overtly bad feelings about all people of a certain race. And that really hinders our ability to unpack this problem, because racism is so much bigger than just individual acts of meanness. So I have the presentation I've prepared goes through a few definitions to set us up for future conversations, so that we can all be sort of in our mind thinking about the same problem or the same thing, the same definitions when we're having these conversations. So let me go ahead and share my
Yeah.
screen.
Thank you for setting that up.
So when I click on the next slide, it's going to go into a short video that's going to talk to us about the very meaning of race, as just the word race, because a lot of us, including myself prior to getting into this work, do not really have very much understanding of what race is and means, how it's used in the world, and where it came from.
You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real. One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776. He came up with 5 different groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors. Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled black and decided were fundamentally different. But as political priorities change, definitions of race in America adjust right along with them. For example, if you were of Mexican birth or ancestry in the United States in 1929, you were considered white. Then the 1930 census changed that to non-white to limit immigration. Later, when the U.S. needed to increase its labor force during World War II, these people were switched back to white. And what it took to be black once varied so wildly throughout the country, from 1/4 to 1/16 to the infamous 1 drop of African ancestry, that people could actually change races just by crossing state lines. Then suddenly in 2000, the government decided that Americans could be more than one race and added a multiracial category to the census. This has left many Americans scratching their heads when it comes to selecting who they are. As many as 6.2% of census respondents selected some other race in a 2010 survey. The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the President of the United States. Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent, but the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is. This is all because there isn't a race chromosome in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist. When the medical community links race to health outcomes, it's really just using race as a substitute for other factors, such as where your ancestors came from, or the experiences of people who may have been put in the same racial group as you. Dorothy Roberts explains that sickle cell anemia is a prime example of this. The disease is linked to areas with high rates of malaria, which include some parts of Europe and Asia in addition to Africa. It's not actually about race at all. This, of course, does not mean that the concept of race isn't hugely important in our lives. The racial categories to which we're assigned can determine real-life experiences, they can drive political outcomes, and they can even make the difference between life and death. But understanding that racial categories are made up can give us an important perspective on where racism came from in the first place.
So I hope y'all could hear that, and we can certainly share the link
Yes.
in the show notes, if you will, so that people can watch it on their own on YouTube. But another word, when we're going to talk about racism, an important word to talk about is prejudice. And so anyone can be prejudiced. And a prejudice is a prejudgment or unjustifiable and usually negative attitude of one type of individual or group toward another group and its members, typically based on stereotypes, which are unsupported generalizations. And a prejudice denies the right of individual members of certain groups to be recognized and treated as individuals with individual characteristics. This is important because when we talk about racism, what we're talking about is racism is prejudice plus power. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can define racism, and I'm not saying at all that this is the only one gold standard way, but I'm saying that it helped me understand why someone says, well, you know, there's so much reverse racism going on right now against white people. Because the fact is that as a group in the United States, white people have the power to make their prejudice really significantly, deeply impact the lives of the larger group of Black and Latinx and other people of color. So when we're talking about racism in this category, we're not just talking about having, you know, bad feelings, which I guess would be prejudice, but having the bad feelings and the power and the way that those two interact to make life difficult for Black people and other people of color. And it's also important for us to think about the ways that racism shows up, because like I said, it's not just bigotry or discrimination by an individual based on race. That is true, and that is racism. Hate crimes are something that the Houston Coalition Against Hate works on a lot, and we want to prevent, and it's incredibly important because it has a big impact on the individual and on the group. But more importantly, from a societal standpoint, are two other levels of racism known as institutional racism and structural racism. So institutional racism can be defined as the policies, practices, and procedures that work better for white people than for Black, Indigenous, or people of color, often unintentionally. So these are the kind of institutions where, because I could afford to take an unpaid internship as a journalism student when I went to Northwestern, I was more likely to get a job in journalism immediately out of college than someone who, because their family didn't have the economic status that I had, they had to work a summer job. That is a kind of institutional racism. That's not my fault, and it's not my responsibility per se. It's just a fact that because of who I was born as, it was easier for me to get that work. A structural racism is the cumulative impact of institutional racism across all institutions over generations. So that is where we start talking about housing policy and criminal justice policy and educational policy, and the ways that those systems impact large numbers of people over lifetimes and generations. So then the last word, and this really trips a lot of people up, and I understand that, and it tripped me up when I first heard it too. But we have to talk about the idea of white supremacy, if for no other reason than for you to understand when other people are talking about white supremacy, what do they mean? It does not mean that we think that all white people are inherently bad, inherently racist, inherently going out with their white hood and the KKK and doing everything they can to hold down people of color and Black people. That is not what it means. When we're talking in an anti-racism education space about white supremacy, What we're talking about is a system of structural advantages and rights that white people have that other racial and ethnic groups do not, both at the collective and the individual level. And so I love this quote by Michael Eric Dyson. It doesn't demand the individual participation of the singular bigot. It's a machine operating in perpetuity because it doesn't demand that somebody be in place driving. And so being aware of it is incredibly important because it is imperative to dismantle this system in order to have the racial equality and justice that is our calling to create God's kingdom here on earth.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
White supremacy,
I'm gonna
we know it's lethal to people of color. 100%. It is toxic to us too, and we don't even know it. And it needs us to not acknowledge it for it to continue operating. It's a disease. It's also an addiction, kind of. It's like in that I think I'm sober, but I'm only sober one day at a time. Like today, I'm sitting here. I'm like, oh, look at me. I'm in this roundtable discussion. I must like know something, right? And it's unconscious. Tomorrow there'll be something new that that will be uncovered to me about being white, about the system of white supremacy. It is so invisible and our culture. And we are trained as a culture, maybe not in your home, because in my home it was different than yours, but we're trained not to bring it up, not to talk about it, not to see it, not to acknowledge it, not to own it.
So I just wanted to include that small clip from Instagram. I'm sorry the video is so small, but just to show like that it is a constant system that even I who talk about this every single day make mistakes, learn new things. So it's not something where, you know, there's you're right, you're wrong, you're good, you're bad. There's no dichotomy here. It's just a spectrum of learning. So I think those are the main slides that I wanted to share from that presentation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And that's that little piece alone I mean, I'm sure you're introducing this to many people that probably didn't even know that this kind of information exists, or have been able to have access to such a perspective. So that's the idea. Now I'm talking to everybody that's going to be joining us in these conversations. That's the idea that that every week we're going to bring an education piece. We're going to talk about our own experience, but we're definitely going to hone in on all this is held in God's hands. All this is held in God's presence. And I'm pretty sure, Liz, you can vouch for that some of your spiritual practices have been a major component for your own transformation on some of the things that you've talked about as far as your own experience, your own realization. And then, like I said, now even this as your vocation, your call. So I want to invite everyone to lean in towards that, to trust that this is a space, this is a safe space that God is holding all of us, that it's not a cliche saying that if we genuinely want to deepen our faith, if we really want to go from adolescent spirituality to mature spirituality, that these type of conversations are the ones where God is calling us to discern. God is calling us to reflect on a deeper level. You know, part of my job is and part of my passion actually is to guide people to go to the deeper end of their own experience. So I think I shared this with you a couple of weeks ago, that I'm beginning to understand that we're just facilitators of bringing people to God's presence. God's presence in the person, meeting one another is this divine encounter. And then whatever happens between God's presence and this person, that's between them. And we're just bringing them in the same way that we were lured in, through compassion, through love, and through this deep transformation that we're all seeking, that we're all should be hungry for. So thank you so much for this piece, Liz. I really appreciate this. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation. This has been something that I think at one point when we did our Grapple ministry several years ago at Memorial Drive, we did a lot of work together, but here we are again, trying to create spaces again where we can grapple, where we can have conversation in an open way. So I really appreciate you accepting my invitation to this.
Well, thank you for including me.
Yeah. So we will be back next week, and we will bring some more conversation to the table. We thank you so much for joining us. If you have any comments, if you have any questions, please, in the comment area, post them. You can always email me at the church. Pretty much, you can go to Memorial Drive or mdumc.org, and you can look up for my email address. It's real easy. It's Victor Resendiz at mdumc.org. And so anyways, do you want to give your email information, Liz?
Sure. It's Liz at houstonagainst.hate.org. And I hope that you will, we have a website with the same name, and we can be found on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So I hope that you will follow us.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this with me again. I'm going to leave you all with this reflection from Thomas Merton. Speak words of hope. Be human in this most inhuman of ages. Guard the image of man, for it is the image of God. God bless you all, and we will see you all next week. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
We are so glad you joined us for this week's conversation. You're invited to leave any comments or questions in the comments below. I want to leave you with these encouraging words from Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. We'll see you next time.